This is a live look at NASA's Space Launch System rocket and Orion spacecraft ready on Launch Pad 39B. In less than 2 days, SLS will lift off from the pad and return us to the moon after almost 50 years. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us live at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Megan Cruz with NASA Communications. Liftoff of this first uncrewed flight test is currently targeted for Monday, August 29th at 8:33 a.m. Eastern Time. As we speak, our launch team is on console, and they started the countdown around 10 this morning. This briefing is to update you all on the Artemis I Mission Management Team meeting that wrapped up about an hour ago. Here are today's participants. We have Mike Sarafin, Artemis Mission Manager, Charlie Blackwell-Thompson, Artemis Launch Director. And joining us from Houston, we have Judd Freiling, Ascent and Entry Flight Director, and also Rick LaBrode, Lead Flight Director. Back here at Kennedy, we have Melissa Jones. She's the Recovery Director. And we have Jacob Bleacher, Chief Exploration Scientist, and also Melody Lovin, Launch Weather Officer. Thank you all for being here. Okay, we're going to start with some opening remarks from each of our guests, and then we're going to take questions from social media, also reporters in the room and over the phone. So, Mike, why don't you go ahead?
All right, good morning. This morning we activated the mission management team as part of our standard flight readiness process at launch minus 2 days. That was essentially our launch readiness review, and we talked about our setup for Monday, August the 29th, our weather, and what our just overall readiness posture is for the 2-hour launch window from 8:33 to 10:33 Eastern. Our potential outcomes on Monday are that we could go within the window, or we could scrub for any number of reasons. We're not going to promise that we're going to get off on Monday. We could have weather, we could have technical issues, or we could have a range and public safety hold, and or a combination of any of those. But we do feel good about our attempt on Monday in terms of our overall setup. And we polled the mission management team today, and we're ready to proceed through the next decision gate, which is the tanking meeting that will happen late Saturday night at around 10:50 p.m. Eastern. Macro issues that we're working that came out of today's mission management team meeting pertain to just our overall readiness from a communications asset coverage standpoint. We did take one action coming out of today's mission management team meeting, and we've got a follow-up call at 2 o'clock Eastern to just affirm our readiness for the communications on the Orion spacecraft, on the interim cryo propulsion stage, or the ICPS, which is our upper stage that commits us to the point of translunar injection, as well as on the Space Launch System. We've had a few just late changes associated with that, so we're just going to go through our communications coverage plan with a fine-tooth comb one last time to ensure that we're ready. But right now we don't anticipate that will be an issue. We did approve 2 real-time requirements changes associated with flight rules. Requirements change authority transitions to the mission management team when we're activated, and those were due to largely late analysis, and that's not uncommon to have real-time requirements changes, especially in the area of flight rules before we go fly. As our 0-hour approaches for the Artemis generation, we do have a heightened sense of anticipation, and there's definitely excitement amongst the team members. We've noticed just the overall mood and focus within the team is definitely a positive one. We're mindful that this is a test flight, and we're mindful that this is a purposeful stress test of the Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System rocket. It is a new creation. It is a new rocket and a new spacecraft to send humans to the moon on the very next flight. This is something that has not been done in over 50 years and is incredibly difficult. We will learn a great deal from the Artemis I test flight, and through this experience, we will change and modify anything necessary to prepare ourselves for crewed flight on the very next mission. We understand that there's a lot of excitement about this, but the team is very focused. In terms of our mission priorities, they determine our courses of action. Our #1 mission priority is to test the vehicle at lunar reentry conditions. We need the rocket to do its job in order to set those initial conditions up. Number 2 priority is to demonstrate the vehicle in the flight environment. Number 3 priority is to retrieve the spacecraft for programmatic cost savings and reuse of avionics, also to reuse the crew module for environmental testing, and then to retrieve the data on board. And then number 4 is what we call bonus objectives, our payload objectives. So we're really focused on that, and we'll see what Monday brings. Those are my opening comments.
Great, Mike, thank you so much. Charlie.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is great to be here. And I was here about 5 days ago, and we were talking a little bit about the flight readiness review and the work that we had in front of us. And I am happy to report that the work we had in front of us out of that review about 5 days ago has all been completed and is all on schedule. That included our booster servicing ops. We finished up that. We got into our post-ops on Thursday. We worked through our pad configuration for launch, got our engine service platform that provides access to both the engine area as well as the boosters. We got that lowered and into launch position. We finished up quite a bit of our pad configuration work on Thursday, and then early on Friday morning we finished up all of the Orion closeouts for flight. The late stow was completed in the days leading up to that, and the Orion and the last hatch were closed out. So from a vehicle configuration, we're in great shape there. So all that work was completed prior to call to stations. I was in the Launch Control Center just this morning, and the team is very excited. We did complete our call to stations at right on time at 09:53, and as you know, our countdown clock is now moving. We have 2 built-in holds. We have 1 prior to tanking, and we recently increased the length of that hold to 2.5 hours, and then we have a 30-minute built-in hold prior to terminal count. So our teams came in early this morning prior to call to stations to power up the Orion spacecraft. Orion is powered, and we are going through some of our pre-checks, and we'll get into a little bit later into our comm configuration of Orion, and we have a series of tests and checkouts that we'll do as part of that. We'll also be bringing up core stage and ICPS, which is our upper stage, and configuring that for flight. And those checks will run over the next day or so. Tomorrow, we will get into our final configuration for tanking, and our tanking is scheduled to begin just after midnight. So on Sunday night, just after midnight, we'll begin loading the cryogenics into the core stage. We start out with LOX, and then we move over to LH2, and then we pick up with upper stage after that. We anticipate having all stages in replenish early in the morning on Monday morning, somewhere around the 6 o'clock mark. And after that, we have about 90 minutes or so of range safety checks that we'll go through and work. We demonstrated them during wet dress, so we'll go through and do those checkouts once again. And then the countdown clock will continue to T-minus 10 minutes, where we have a 30-minute built-in hold. During that hold, we will do our final checks and our final poll for launch, and provided that those checks are all favorable and we have a clear, what we call a clear constraints board, I will give the team the final go for launch, and we will count down for that on-time liftoff at 08:33. At this time, we are not, as a launch team, working any issues, any significant issues, so I'm happy to report that, and everything is proceeding on schedule. And with that, I'll hand it over to Judd.
All right, thanks, Charlie. Let's see. So, assuming we launch at the open of the window at 8:33 in the morning, the vehicle will lift off at about 5.7 million pounds total weight. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the abort boundaries and milestones throughout the Ascent phase of flight. Once we lift off, we'll start immediately about 7 seconds in a roll to the heads down position to put Orion in that heads down position. At 54 seconds in the flight, we'll be supersonic, going Mach 1. a minute and 3 seconds, we will get to a boundary where if we lose a single engine, we'll be able to make our mission priority 1 objective that Mike spoke about. We continue on uphill, 2 minutes and 10 seconds, the solid rocket boosters will separate, and then we will start our closed loop guidance control, targeting insertion point. A little later on, about a minute later, at 3 minutes 11 seconds, we'll have the SM panel jettison, which will expose the service module and the stowed solar arrays on that module. 5 seconds later, we'll have the last jettison, or the launch abort system jettison, and that will expose the Orion crew module. That will be the start of our abort capability. After that last jettison, we will start with our Mode 2 abort, which is also known as untargeted abort splashdown. We'll continue to press. After 3 minutes and 23 seconds, we'll have a boundary which we call press to MECO. If we lose a single engine, we'll be able to make full mission after that 3 minutes and 23 seconds. Following that, around 5 minutes or so, as the combined vehicle continues on uphill, the SRBs that we previously jettisoned will splash down in the Atlantic. Continuing forward, we'll have at 7 minutes and 26 seconds, we'll start our overlap of our Mode 4 abort, also known as abort once around, which means we can make the Pacific or off the coast of California. And then we will end our Mode 2 abort at 7 minutes 33 seconds, which will be the point at which our initial impact point, our instantaneous impact point, reaches the coast of Africa. At 8 minutes 1 second, we'll command MECO, and we'll leave the vehicle at about 400,000 pounds weight. Continue on from there. We'll deploy the solar arrays from the service module at 18 minutes MET. That'll take about 12 minutes and give us the ability then to charge the batteries on the Orion capsule. Continuing forward, once we deploy the solar arrays, we'll have our perigee raise maneuver, which will bring up our perigee from 16 nautical miles perigee to 100 nautical miles. That will be at about 51 minutes, and that'll be about a 20-second burn. Continuing forward, we will have our final burn that is done by the ICPS upper stage. That will be the translunar injection burn at approximately an hour 36 minutes. Following shortly at around an hour and 44 minutes, splashdown of the core stage in between Hawaii and the West Coast. About 10 minutes after we do the TLI burn completes, which is an 18-minute burn, we will then separate the upper stage from the Orion space capsule. The Orion space capsule will continue on to the moon and its mission. And shortly thereafter, I will hand over to Rick LaBrode, the lead flight director for this mission, and he will start with his modal survey. So, Rick?
All right. Thank you, Judd. All right, then, as Judd said, after TLI, Orion will be on its way to the moon. On the trip out to the moon, we're going to perform a series of small correction burns. It's just to make sure that when we encounter the lunar, our first lunar encounter is going to be on target. That'll be on flight day 6. When we pass by the moon, we're going to be approximately 60 miles off the surface of the moon. And that's when we're going to do our first large burn. It's called the outbound powered flyby. And that burn is going to then send Orion up to the distant retrograde orbit. So on flight day 10, we'll do our second large burn, and that'll actually insert Orion into the DRO, the distant retrograde orbit. We'll spend just under 2 weeks in orbit around the moon. And then on flight day 23, we're going to go ahead and depart DRO and start heading back to the moon. That's our DRI burn. And then on flight day 35 is when we'll encounter the moon again, and we'll do our return power flyby, our last large burn, and that burn actually is going to target entry interface. It's essentially our deorbit burn. And then on the return leg, we'll continue to do a series of those correction burns to make sure that we're right on target for the entry interface. throughout the mission, we're also going to be performing a lot of checkouts and demonstrations just to get a better feel for how Orion's going to operate in that environment. Also, if at any time during the mission Orion encounters a problem, a serious problem that warrants bringing Orion home early, we can select early return trajectories. We also call them aborts. And it's really dependent on what phase of the mission we're in when that happens. On the outbound leg, we could do direct aborts, where we just turn around and come right back to the Earth. Or we could change the trajectory to a lunar flyby. Once we've gone into the DRO, we're a little bit more limited, but we can depart early if necessary and the timing's right. And then in all these cases, it would just bring Orion back. It would bring EI in earlier to get it back safe and sound. The teams, we've worked through all these scenarios. We're fully trained on all the various options, have the standard procedures to take care of these actions if necessary. And then once we've done our RTC 6, or Return Trajectory Correction burn number 6, then we'll hand over to Judd's team for the last phase of the mission.
All right, thanks, Rick. Yeah, as Rick mentioned, essentially our deorbit burn is way back at the moon. That return power flight by burn. That's about a week before we get to the Earth, and that's targeting an entry interface point in space, and that's 400,000 feet above the Earth's surface. And for this particular launch day on the 29th, that'll be just to the southeast of Hawaii. 20 minutes prior to that entry interface, we will separate the crew module from the service module, and the crew module will perform a separation burn that will raise its altitude slightly, make sure that we have a proper separation and proper angle to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. We'll be performing a skip entry on this mission. Essentially, we'll come in at 400,000 feet at about a little over 24,000 miles per hour. We'll dig into the Earth's atmosphere at about 200,000 feet above the Earth's surface. We'll roll to make the capsule's lift vector go skyward again. We'll get to an apogee of the capsule around 250,000 feet, and then we'll continue to descend down into the atmosphere all the way to the Pacific Ocean. We'll have various milestones along the way, particularly at around 28,000 feet. We'll jettison the forward bay cover that will expose all of the main parachutes and drogues. And by that time, we will have slowed down from that 24,000 miles per hour to roughly 500 miles per hour. 300 miles per hour. We'll deploy the main chutes and come down a soft landing in the Pacific Ocean, right in the vicinity of the recovery forces. We will stay in the ocean for approximately 2 hours while we do some thermal soakback tests to test the capsule for when the capsule becomes crewed on Artemis II. And then we will hand it over to Melissa Jones and the recovery team. Back to you.
Judd and Rick, thank you so much for that detailed look at what to expect. And yeah, why don't we turn it over to Melissa now for recovery.
Thank you. So for the last 5 years, the recovery team has been working with the DoD off the coast of San Diego to prepare for this mission. We've done 5 underway recovery tests for Artemis I, and there were 4 previous to that for EFT-1. Our last one was last fall, and we were certified and ready to go. And so the timeline for deployment, it's a 42-day mission. We will wait until we launch, and we're confident when we're landing, and we deploy about 20 days prior to splashdown. We load the landing platform Dock 17 ship that we use from the Navy, which has a big swimming pool underneath the flight deck where we recover and float the capsule in. And we go out with them. We bring a helicopter squadron, a dive company with us, in addition to the weather squadron. and we use the DoD to go out and practice recovering the capsule with the NASA technical team that runs the hardware in the well deck, the ground support equipment in the well deck that we bring the capsule in with. We'll secure it in the well deck, and we'll bring it back to Naval Base San Diego, where we will make sure that it is safe to transport across the country, and expect to get back to KSC within about 13 days of landing, so that we can do that deservicing here at KSC and get that avionics off as quick as possible, as Mike mentioned earlier. In addition to nominal end of mission, the team I lead is responsible for landing anywhere in the world. So all of those aborts, early returns, alternate missions that Judd and Rick mentioned, we have to be ready to support those. We do have 2 contingency teams that are trained and ready to deploy in the event that we have an event we're not expecting to. And we will monitor the mission every day and respond as we need to respond. So we are ready to go. We've identified our teams. We're packed. We're ready. We're excited to fly this mission. I'm going to kick it over to Jacob.
Thank you. Very excited to be here today. Very historic moment. I'm glad to be here with my colleagues. I'm here today to discuss the Artemis I science objectives. You heard from Mike already about the primary objectives. Unlike the primary objectives that are broadly focusing on understanding SLS during launch and flying the Orion spacecraft, the secondary objectives are not critical for understanding and preparing for Artemis II, but they will provide us with knowledge that helps us prepare for some of our future Artemis missions. The types of data that science and exploration tend to acquire actually have significant overlap. A phrase I like to use is that science is exploration's toolbox for survival. What we learn through scientific measurements tells us about the environments in which we plan to operate. This is the type of information that helps us then ultimately develop the systems, the architecture that we'll build. Likewise, for each human exploration mission, there are numerous opportunities for science to be conducted, technology demonstrations to be conducted. So it's really our job to look for and take advantage of those opportunities as best as we can, which we are doing for Artemis I. Really, science enables exploration, and exploration enables science. So the payloads and instruments on Artemis I reflect contributions from across our agency, including 5 international partners and partnership with academia, industry, as well as other research institutions. There are basically 2 groups of secondary payloads. We have CubeSats, which will ride along with the SLS and be deployed at several steps along the path. And then we also have activities that will be conducted within the Orion. The CubeSats, these are really kind of a low-cost, high-risk but high-reward type of activity. They're basically each their own little spacecraft, and they're roughly the size of a shoebox, not very heavy, about 25 pounds. And so unlike larger science missions, you can kind of get some targeted measurements from these. The hard part's trying to get them up into orbit. And so this is one of those opportunities that we're taking full advantage of in Artemis I. It's riding along with the SLS. And often CubeSats go into a low Earth orbit. So in this case, we're providing a very unique opportunity for them to get farther out. So we have a series of these CubeSats. Some of them are testing technology for navigating in deep space. We even have one that's traveling farther out, going to encounter an asteroid. But some of them will be focusing more on the moon, making measurements of the moon, in fact, mapping where some of the water deposits might be. Again, this is important to us looking forward, planning future Artemis missions, understanding where some of these valuable resources are located. We'll be learning how to fly in space. We'll even actually have one that's landing on the surface of the moon. Another key aspect is learning about the radiation environment. So some of these CubeSats will characterize that environment and even study the way that biology responds to that space environment. This is the environment through which our hardware will fly and operate through all future Artemis missions, as well as where our crew members will be living. So it's critical for us to continue to learn about this environment moving forward. Now Orion will also be doing very similar activities. We have a number of dosimeters and other radiation sensors that will ride inside the Orion. And we actually have several Moonikins. We have Commander Campos Moonikin will be flying in the commander seat. That name was selected through a public competition a little while ago. So we're excited for the commander to be flying on this flight. Have some radiation sensors in the flight suit pockets, but also measuring kind of the forces that the commander seat will experience with an astronaut on board. We'll also be testing several ways to try to mitigate radiation that the astronauts could experience in flight. So we'll be using our other mannequins to basically test out suits that could potentially protect them from that radiation. Also on board Orion will be some additional biology experiments that will fly through that deep space environment and actually come back with Orion, so we can actually bring it back and do some analyses here on Earth to better understand it. So together, this really helps lay the groundwork and contribute to the knowledge base that we'll need for future Artemis missions for their success going to the moon. Recently, while addressing the science community at meetings, I've been kind of using this theme with our science mission directorate partners that, man, this is getting real. Mike already talked about the atmosphere, and I can confirm that atmosphere here is like nothing I've ever experienced before. It is definitely getting real. The rocket outside on Launch Pad 39B will be writing the next chapter of space exploration and space science. That chapter will include science all along the way, hand in hand with exploration. And I've recently said to our science community, buckle up, everybody. We're going for a ride to the moon. So with that, I'd like to hand off to Melody.
Good morning, everyone. I think it's still technically morning. So I'm very excited to give you the launch weather for Monday, but before we get to that, I have to talk about the weather pattern for today, and I don't think I'm going to surprise anyone in this room when I tell you that it's probably going to rain today. So with that, we'll go ahead and look at satellite, and we'll go ahead and talk about the pattern. So this morning, as you're looking at satellite, you can see some thunderstorms beginning to form along the west coast of Florida today, and we're also seeing some little clouds begin to form across the space coast. So with that, we do have a light south-southwesterly flow regime in place, and what that normally means is we're going to have some of those sea breezes collide along the east coast of Florida this afternoon. And because the flow is so light, a lot of these storms are going to be boundary driven, which means some are going to be traveling west, some are going to be traveling east. It's a stormy afternoon for sure that's in store for us. As we get into tomorrow, this flow regime is actually going to switch to more of an onshore flow regime out of the south-southeast. What that normally means is that we will have showers and thunderstorms approaching the coastline during the morning time frames. For any work that needs to get done out at the pad tomorrow, we will likely still have thunderstorms, but we'll probably be able to have a lower lightning threat in the late afternoon and early evening hours, and that is just due to the fact that the east coast sea breeze will likely move west away from the spaceport during that time frame. So now let's get into launch weather, the actual outlook for Monday morning. So with that, we do have a probability of 70% of favorable weather, so that is a probability of violation of 30%, i.e. 70% go. The weather looks pretty decent, as you can tell by the probability. The main concern, of course, is going to be those offshore showers and possibly a few thunderstorms as well. So with that, the cumulus cloud rule, the surface electric field rule, and the flight through precipitation rule will mainly be our concerns during that time frame. You may notice I don't have a backup launch window forecast for you, and that is because that is a 6-day forecast, and we don't do launch forecasts earlier than 3 or 4 days. So for an outlook for that, we would have that available on Monday if we need that. So with that, I can go ahead and conclude my portion of the brief. Enjoy the launch.
Melody, thank you. All right, we now invite reporters in the room to ask questions, but also reporters on the phone will be taking questions from you and also social media. And in order to bring those questions to us, just use the hashtag Artemis. All right, so a question in the room right there.
Marcia Dunn, Associated Press. Charlie, how late can you delay fueling and still make the window on Monday? And for Melissa, you mentioned that, you could be chasing this capsule anywhere around the world when it's coming back. How equipped is it to land on land versus water? And when there's a crew on board, how do you possibly deploy your crew to anywhere in the world?
All right, so I'll talk about the tanking question first. We have taken all of the lessons learned from wet dress, and we did make some additional changes to the tanking timeline. You'll notice that we actually we increased that hold prior to tanking from an hour and a half to 2.5 hours, and that was to allow us to back some of the work up to align us really well for an on-time tanking. But certainly on any given day, you can have a technical issue or you could have a weather issue. We do have a 2-hour launch window. And so we have the ability to certainly, press within that 2 hours. So how late can we be? It really depends on which part of the tanking we got held up in, because, we have a sequence of how we need to go load, core stage, then upper stage. But if it was at the very beginning, I would say we have about 2 hours there and still make the end of the window. But you get more flexibility, certainly, depending on, when you actually started the tanking operations.
And for the questions you asked me, so the capsule's not designed to land on land. That would be definitely the worst day for us. Unfortunately, we don't have to protect for landing anywhere in the world. Our flight ops folks have a really good understanding of where it's going to land. In fact, I could kick that over to them if they wanted to answer that. But we're looking at a low percentage for Atlantic abort and a very high percentage in the Pacific coast or Pacific Ocean between San Diego all the way to Hawaii and down to Mexico. So we focus the assets that we have in those areas, and that's where we deploy those teams. But it's going to be a real-time call based on where are we at, how far to sea are we, what assets are in that area, and what do we know about the health of the capsule. In addition to that, there's a tri-band beacon that will activate on top of the capsule. It gives us about 96 hours to find the capsule, is what we're planning for at this time.
Thank you for those questions. Bill?
Bill Harwood, CBS News. And Charlie, I hate to ask you this question one more time, but can you help me understand exactly when you're going to find out that 4-inch QD is actually tight?
I can, Bill, and I actually brought that data because I promised it to you when we were here before, and so I wrote down the very specific times. As you know, once we get core stage in LH2, core stage into replenish, we're going to get into our kickstart bleed, and that is at 03:33 local time. So once we get core stage replenished, now of course if we end up with the tanking sliding a little bit, it'll slide accordingly. But right now, just after 3:30 in the morning, when we get into kickstart, we'll put some pressure on the tank. We'll begin that bleed process, and at that point in time is when we'll know if that QD has an issue. That's when we saw it last time. We saw the performance of it last time, and we would expect to see it at that time. And then, of course, once we get into the kickstart, we'll run that for about 45 minutes, and then we will get into our vented bleed, which is another 90 minutes, and then that gets us set up for the pre-press test.
Irene?
Thanks. Sorry. Irene Klotz with Aviation Week. I think this is probably for Mike. So PAO provided us with some of the risk assessments for the loss of vehicle, but I didn't really understand what drives the numbers aside from the launch risk and the reentry risk. And there's something in flight that seems to be the primary driver. So if you could just break that down a little bit for us. Thanks.
Yeah, so the last time we talked about the loss of vehicle risk, and as I recall, the number that I wasn't ready to quote at that time is 1 in 125. And the team does what they call a probabilistic risk assessment based on the known failure modes of the individual subsystems, levels of redundancy, common cause failure, a whole host of factors, and they look at the individual flight phases, the ascent flight phase, the in-space flight phase, and then the reentry flight phase. And anything that is seen as a catastrophic cause associated with that probabilistic risk assessment goes into the assessment. And then each cause itself, whether it's number 1, number 5, number 100, is assigned a probability. And some of our top risk drivers are common to any other program out there. Micrometeorite orbital debris is a key risk driver. The parachute system on the vehicle is a key risk driver. And we've got a couple of others that the heat shield, the reentry thermal protection system. Those are all critical systems that have to work, and those are on our top drivers. Obviously, the duration of the mission affects your micrometeoroid and orbital debris risk. The longer you're up there, the longer your window of exposure is to a critical hit associated with micrometeoroid or orbital debris. Heat shield is kind of a byproduct, or there's a relationship between the thermal protection system and the orbital debris environment, specific to the back shell of Orion, not specific to the base heat shield. The base heat shield is not exposed until you get to crew and service module separation, which is only about 20 minutes prior to entry interface. So the opportunity for a micrometeoroid deploy or micrometeoroid impact is very limited associated with that. The other top risk drivers that I can think of, the SLS avionics and software, the Orion propulsion system were all key drivers. So, each of those has a different flight phase effectivity. Obviously, the SLS avionics and software only affect the launch vehicle up to the point where it's done its job. Orion has a much larger window of exposure to all of its risks. The propulsion system has to work from the point that it separates from the launch vehicle all the way to the point of entry interface. So each of those have a different ranking, and those are the top risk drivers that come to mind right now, and that's what drove that 1 in 125 number.
Thank you, Mike. Right over here.
Hi, Chris Gephardt with NSF for Charlie. Are there any cutouts or COLAs that you're aware of already for the count on Monday? And then in terms of the CubeSats that are on this mission, how many, you mentioned one's landing, how many are entering orbit of the moon as well? Thank you.
And I'll also hand over to Judd, too, if he wants to talk a little bit about the COLAs and the cutouts. But we do have a number of cutouts in our launch window that we anticipate. We have been practicing those as part of our simulations. And while we got a report today, I haven't had a chance to look at it. But the one that I got a few days ago showed somewhere on the order of about 35 to 40 very small cutouts within the launch window. Judd, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Charlie, the only thing that I'd add to that is there are two flavors of cutouts that we have. We work both with the 45th Squadron and also the 18th. So we have very small cutouts for the portion of the trajectory that is just the core stage associated. So obviously once we MECO, the core stage continues to go up to a point where the 45th is still responsible for that range, and so we have those cutouts. And then we also assess the cutouts associated with the combined stack, ICPS and Orion, and those extend a little bit longer all the way up to TLI.
Yeah, so we have a couple of CubeSats that are actually going to go into orbit to make measurements of the South Polar region. So there are two that science measurements like that. We also have several that are kind of going around the moon but not fully staying in orbit. So it kind of depends what you mean by going into orbit. But we have several of them will go there. Again, a few of them are going off on their own pathways to make measurements either out of the solar wind or out to another destination, like I mentioned, an asteroid.
We have another question in the room, right there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Ken Kramer, Space Up Close. I want to ask about the CubeSats, and specifically, I'm interested in the ones looking for hydrogen and water ice. Can you describe their mission a little bit? How long will they last? And will they also help NASA in the selection of the landing sites for Artemis III and beyond? Thank you.
Yeah, so several of the CubeSats will make measurements with various instruments, neutron detectors, other spectrometers, to look at the water environment in the polar region. The reason that we're interested in the South Polar region of the moon broadly in Artemis is that we believe there to be water deposits, which would be a valuable resource to us, but also a valuable science target. This ice, potentially deposited over the history of the solar system, can give us data about how our solar system has evolved. So we're trying to understand how much is there. Is it only stuck in some of these places, these craters that never see sunlight? We typically see the concentrations there because we call them volatiles, because the solar wind would essentially strip them away, cause them to volatilize, and then they're lost. So that's why the polar region in general, the South Pole, is unique from past exploration of the moon. So these CubeSats will help us gain a better understanding of how broad those deposits are, perhaps how much might be there, how accessible it could be to us. So that's the type of measurement that's being made with these CubeSats, and they'll be doing that over periods of months as they get into an orbit, and depends how long they can stay in those orbits. Well, any knowledge we gain will certainly help influence decisions down the road. All the knowledge we gain from any scientific observation about the South Polar region would influence that. So I can't specifically say, yes, that data will be critical in making a decision on a landing site, but it will all factor in as part of the knowledge base from which we make that. So with the addition of the CubeSats to Artemis I, we do have observations that will help us as we move forward in Artemis.
Another question here.
Hey, good luck Monday. Congratulations on getting here, of course. Been hearing from some folks kind of under the radar. There's some concerns about how long SLS has been out on the pad, exposed to elements. Perhaps this is a question for Mike. But I'm just wondering if you can kind of quantify. I know it was briefly mentioned at one point pushing into the fall might cause some concerns about how long SLS was out there, but at this point, how much of a concern is that related to corrosion or other elements? Thanks.
Yeah, we do track what we consider to be limited lifetime items, and we've got a whole host of systems that either were previously activated or we had to be mindful of their timing relative to setting up for a launch attempt. Certainly the loading of hypergolic fuel that's used for reaction control systems is one of those items that we look at. There are a whole host of other items that we do track. None of those right now relative to the launch period that we're looking at are key risk or key concerns, and we did review those at the flight readiness review, and while we understand there's a non-zero level of risk associated with the amount of time that hardware elements from the tip of the Orion spacecraft all the way to the tail of the rocket have been out there, we've characterized that, we've been tracking it, and right now there aren't any pokeouts that we're concerned with.
We have a question in the front row here.
Thank you, Tarek Malik with Space.com. I think for Mike, you mentioned earlier just the nature of the test flight, that there could be weather, there could be a glitch that might cause a delay. And I'm curious what the rationale or plan is in terms of going to a backup day like September 2nd or 5th, and depending on the nature, of course, of whatever issue. Earlier in the month at the media day, there was discussion about the amount of fuel available and having to pick the 2nd or the 5th. Is that issue solved, and you can go for both of those days with enough prop to fuel the vehicle both times? Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, I'll take a first crack, and Charlie, you can add anything here. But we're comfortable with any of the opportunities in front of us. We do have varying launch windows depending on which day we're talking about. When we start getting to September 5th, we start having less than the full 2-hour launch window. So September 5th is about a 90-minute window, and September 6th is a 24-minute window. Otherwise, we've got 2-hour windows in front of us. In terms of why we scrubbed or what the next setup is, I really do look to Charlie and her launch operations team in terms of what the art of the possible is. And if that is a technical reason, she's going to come to us and tell us, if we need to gain access to the vehicle, what the art of the possible is. And if it was simply a scrub and need to replenish commodity, she'll tell us what the art of the possible is. I don't know, Charlie, if you have additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think what you may be referring to is our replenishment plan. We, in the 850,000-gallon hydrogen sphere that we have out at the pad, we get one launch attempt after that. And so we do require a couple of days to go replenish hydrogen. What we will do, because we have that cutout in the launch window between the 29th and the 2nd, we will go ahead and top off both LOX and hydrogen, which really sets us up nicely for an opportunity when that window reopens on the 2nd. And then it also gives us some flexibility in the scrub because we will only need to take hydrogen after that. So while as a launch director, you always want to be, you want launch opportunities close together, but this cutout actually provides us a nice opportunity to top everything off and be in a great position to make a run at it on the 2nd. And then certainly after that, we would only need to take hydrogen, which takes a minimum of 48 hours.
Thank you for your question. Over here.
Hi there, Charlie, this is for you. I'm Mary Matheson from Surround Vision, a virtual reality production studio in the UK. And I'm just really intrigued about the sort of female presence and sort of elements to this mission. I've spoken to your colleague Melissa earlier today. You know, obviously we know the name is really significant, as well as obviously the idea, the concept and the ambition of having a woman on the moon. But it feels to me that it's much stronger than that and much deeper than that within NASA and the contractors. So how sort of important is that sort of female element for you personally, and also for future generations who might be interested in getting into this kind of work?
Well, first, I feel extremely blessed to be in the position to lead this launch team and to be a part of this incredible mission. There is, without a doubt, a female presence as part of this in both the leadership of this program and the operations areas, as well as the name of the program itself. I reflect on Apollo and when we went to the moon before. 50 years ago, we had on the order of one woman, certainly in the case of the Apollo 11 launch, we had one woman in the firing room of 450 men, one. And today our team is made up, our launch control team is made up of about 30%. We have just under 100 engineers that'll be in the firing room on launch day, and 30% are women. So certainly the makeup of our workforce has changed over the course of the 50 years, and it's a very special, for me it's extremely special to be a part of this program and to be given the opportunity as the first woman launch director for NASA.
A question here.
Hello, this is Ada Monzon from Guapa, Puerto Rico. Congratulations to all. We feel the excitement and we thank you. I got two questions. You mentioned weather criteria, technical issues that may delay the launch, but also you mentioned public safety. What do you refer about that? And then for the meteorology side, how do you coordinate with the National Hurricane Center, especially since the September 2nd and 5th window, we may have a closed system near the East Coast? Thank you.
I'll take the public safety and you can take the weather one. Okay. So in terms of public safety, there's a couple of facets that our colleagues at the Eastern Range look at, and they have to do with basically if you have a bad day scenario and either the vehicle has a catastrophic event on the pad surface or while it's in flight, what the consequences are. So there are keep out zones established, whether they're people observing that are not designated as mission critical, and then there are hazard control areas, and Charlie controls those operationally from the firing room. Should we need to send people into those areas, but she knows specifically who those people are and what tasks they're going to perform, and the public is not a part of those hazard control areas. But then also you got to look at the downstream trajectory of the vehicle as it heads uphill, and what that means to any land that you might overfly or water that you overfly. And we do have a variable azimuth on this vehicle, which actually, depending on the time you launch, the trajectory is adjusted ever so slightly. So we provide all of that trajectory information to our range counterparts, and they assess the likelihood of what they call an expectation of casualty associated with known population densities downstream of that launch site for the trajectory that you're going to fly. So that is what we refer to as just general public safety. Should somebody incur in those keep out zones, we could actually hold the launch for that, and we don't want to do that, right? So we have what are called notice to airmen or notice to air missions now, and then notice to mariners that are issued prior to launch, and anybody that is flying an aircraft or on a boat downrange or in the exclusion zone needs to be aware of that, and that's how we manage it publicly. In addition to controlling where visitors and guests are, either on the Kennedy Space Center or nearby areas. So that's what we mean when we generically talk about public safety. But there is a long and robust process that is put in place that is tailored to the vehicle and the amount of propellant on board and the trajectory that it's going to fly. And Melody, I guess you had the weather question.
Absolutely. So I believe the question was, how do we coordinate with the Hurricane Center? We are completely following the Hurricane Center. It is their forecast. The National Hurricane Center is the expert on forecasting any kind of tropical system. We take their forecasts and we follow it to the T. We are always watching the changing outlook and the forecast, and their broad outlooks of 2 to 5 days are produced every 6 hours. Every morning I brief Charlie about the outlook so that you can be assured that the team is well prepared for any tropical threats that may approach us. As far as the backup launch window, you're right that we are absolutely climbing the peak of hurricane season. It's just a matter of time before we start seeing something form off the coast of Africa. And with the current outlook today, I would not be shocked if we saw a named storm when we're looking at the backup window for late next week. But that is a 6-day forecast, so all we can do is really watch and react as fast as we can do.
Thank you both.
Castel with Radio Canada. Can you sum up the major differences with Artemis II in terms of countdown and criteria, please?
Let's see. I'll take a crack at that one, and Rick or Judd, you can add anything if you want. But certainly the countdown itself would be very similar in terms of getting the vehicle powered up and fueled. The main difference is we'll have the crew wake up and get suited and then send them out to the pad, and then we'll have to get into hatch closure and then and ensure that their comm is working, their suits are pressurized, the side hatch seals properly, and that happens relatively late in the countdown. I know Rick or Judd, if you have anything to add to that one.
Yeah, Mike. As far as the actual mission for Artemis II, the trajectory will look quite a bit different than Artemis I. For that one, the ICPS actually, instead of doing the full TLI maneuver, will just put us in a really highly elliptical orbit while we do checkouts of the environmental systems for the crew. That's for about 24 hours, and then the Orion OMS engine will actually finish the translunar injection burn that day later after doing the environmental checkouts. The trajectory to the moon is just going to be a lunar flyby, so we'll go around the moon, come back, and it'll be a much shorter amount of time than Artemis I. Back to you.
All right, there's quite a number of hands in the room. I'm going to try to get to people we haven't gotten to before, and then I'll go back for some second questions. So I believe you haven't gotten yet.
Yeah, Stephen Clark, Spaceflight Now. I think my question's probably for Judd Freiling in Houston. You talked about the abort modes for this particular mission, and I know you don't have an active launch abort motor. Can you maybe go in a little more detail and just clarify a couple of things? You mentioned at 63 seconds you have an abort mode where you could get the priority 1 objectives. What does that mean? And then once the LAS is off the vehicle, can you just go through those modes again, like what the untargeted splashdown means? And I know Preston Miko at that point, I think you said you could go to get the full mission at that point if you lost an engine. Just want to confirm all that stuff. Thanks.
That's a great question, great clarification. So once we get to the minute and 3 seconds or 63 seconds, we have the ability to complete the mission priority 1 objective, and really what that means is we likely will not have enough performance to do the full mission, in other words, go to the DRO, but we will have enough performance between the ICPS upper stage and adding additional energy from the Orion engines to make essentially either a highly elliptical orbit that will still get us the lunar entry speeds, or potentially we could do lunar flyby, much like the mission that we're planning for Artemis II. As far as the abort modes, untargeted splash after the last jettisons, what that really means is should we have a catastrophic failure on the vehicle or something that causes us to have to abort, the service module and the crew module separate from the upper stage and then perform a separation burn, and then essentially the reorient itself does a crew module and service module separation, and then the crew module gets in the proper orientation for an unguided splashdown in the Atlantic undershoots. Certainly, when we get past the press boundary at approximately 3 minutes and 23 seconds, the press to MECO boundary, essentially we can do a completely nominal mission. The 3 remaining engines would burn slightly longer than they normally would be for that 8 minutes, so probably another minute or 2 longer, and then at that point the core stage has done its job actually, and it has put the Orion and the upper stage in the proper orbit to continue a nominal mission.
Okay, right here.
Hi, Lucie Aubourg for AFP News Agency. Just a quick question on the boosters, the solid boosters. Are they retrieved? Will they be reused? And I think it's not the case, so why not?
So the boosters are not reused on this flight, and that is a purposeful performance decision. We wanted to take out the recovery-related equipment. There's mass associated with having attach points, as well as the parachute mechanisms and parachute systems. That is performance that we basically would take away from our ability to send crew and cargo to the moon. So we made a conscious decision to not recover the boosters in the interest of vehicle performance.
Okay, we actually have a question from social, so let's get that one.
Hey, thanks so much. We've got a question from Jay on Twitter. When does the Orion spacecraft switch to the Deep Space Network?
I think that's a question for Judd or Rick.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So after that translunar injection burn, and we pull, that'll send us up above the TDRS satellite constellation, and it'll be at that time. It's the exact time is, Judd, by any chance? I'll have to get the exact time, but it's right after TLI, which is a little over an hour and a half into the mission.
Okay, we have our first phone question. This is Jim McKenna from Aerospace Tech Review. Hi, Jim.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, this is for Judd. With regards to the untargeted splash abort mode, is there a capability to destroy the crew module if for some reason its flight down to the Atlantic becomes unpredictable?
I'm sorry, you broke up. What was the question about the crew module? Is there a possibility to do what?
With regards to the untargeted splash mode, do you have the ability to destroy the crew module if its flight down to the ocean becomes unpredictable?
No, we don't have that capability, so we do expect the chutes to come out and to glide the crew module to a safe splashdown in the water.
Thank you for that question. Any new hands in the room? All right, let's go. Yeah, guy in the purple shirt.
Jeff Faust of Space News. Launch criteria question. We've talked a lot about terrestrial weather. What space weather criteria do you have? And we're entering an era of increased solar activity, and what would be a constraint to launch in that case?
We're primarily concerned with protons from the sun. So that's our only space criteria at this point in time.
Right there. Thank you.
Hey, Micah Maidenberg, Wall Street Journal. Judd, I just want to follow up on Stephen's question just to make sure I kind of know crystal clear. Like after that 63-second sort of threshold that you mentioned, at that point, NASA would know whether like the Orion would get to come back in and test the heat shield. You'll know that soon. That's how I understood your answer to Stephen's question. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. We expect that we will be able to get that mission objective. Obviously, it depends on the performance that we had to that point, but the expectation is once we reach that boundary of 63 seconds and we have a subsequent engine failure after that, our expectation is that through a combination of depleting all of the ICPS fuel, upper stage fuel, and doing essentially a rev around a highly elliptical orbit, we'll use the Orion main engines to achieve lunar entry speeds. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for a few more questions. I know, Chris, you've been waiting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think these are both for Charlie. Given that we might be watching tropical systems next week, how long does your teams need to deconfigure the vehicle to be able to pull it back for a hurricane protection scenario? And you mentioned that the cutoff that gets us to the second gives you some flexibility based on your propellant reload thing. When you say flexibility, does that mean the third and the fourth and the sixth are potential launch options? Like if you don't fuel on the second, could you try for the third, preserve the fifth? Can you just walk me through what those things are on the back of the window? Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. I'm going to take that one first. So because we go ahead and top off both LOX and hydrogen, we're in a really great spot. Now, of course, all scrubs are dependent upon why you scrubbed, what it is. If it's a simple weather scrub, that's, no offense, Melody, but that's that's probably the best case scenario. But if you have a technical issue, you obviously have to go look at how do we go correct it, what does it take to do. But taking both LOX and hydrogen in that window really opens up our capability. So we'll be ready on the second. But if for some reason we couldn't launch on the second, we could look at any a subsequent opportunity. If we decide not to tank, we have a 24-hour hold capability, so we can try the next day. But once we commit to tanking, and depending on how far into the tanking sequence we get, then we get into that replenishment. After each time that we load hydrogen in the core stage, we need some level of replenishment. And so our baseline is about 2 days. Certainly, depending on how much and how far into the load you got before you had an issue would drive what those actual commodities are. And we look at all of that in the scrub meeting. But to answer your question very directly, yes, there are other opportunities that we could look at. It doesn't have to be the second or the fifth. It really depends on why we scrubbed and what kind of issue we're looking at. But for the most part, our scrub turnarounds are always driven by hydrogen replenishment. And what was the first part of your question again? I'm sorry.
If we got into a situation where you needed to roll back for hurricane protection,
yes.
How long do you need to deconfigure the vehicle to pull it back?
We need about 3.5 days. And so we look at the weather every day, look at the tropics, and certainly when I say we have about 3.5 days of work to go do, more is better. That's probably, the streamlined case. And then of course we also have to look at, when we expect local weather to impact here and then back up from that, because we, have a workforce that we have to release and allow them to get home and do their own securing. So we look at it very closely, but it is about 3.5 days, very full days of work to get deconfigured and ready to roll.
Bill, and then Irene, and then another new hand here.
Bill Harwood again. 2 very quick questions for Judd Freiling. Again, following up on Stephen's question, is there any scenario where you could lose 2 engines and still get any mission at all going uphill? And the second question, when you dip into the atmosphere during the skip reentry, and you might have said this and I just missed it, from 400,000 feet, how deep do you go before you come back up and then resume the descent? Thanks.
All right, thanks, Bill. Let's see. The first question about two-engine capability. Yes, there is some amount of two-engine out capability, and so it all depends on where you would have lost the first engine and then in relation to the second engine. The controllability of the stack seems to do pretty well on two engines. So obviously you'd be burning really to the limits of what the gas or the fuel in the core stage can do, and that's probably around 12-ish minutes or so. So it all depends on the timing associated when those two engines went out. As far as your second question, yes, after you get at the 400,000 foot entry interface level, you'll dip down to about 200,000 feet, and then you'll start to come back up, and you'll reach an apogee of about 250,000 feet before you start coming back down again. Back to you, Megan.
Go ahead, Irene.
Week. Mike, I wanted to just follow up on something you said at the post-FRR presser when you were giving us some examples of missions that could be flown if there was a problem, and you had mentioned as an example that Orion solar arrays didn't deploy. In that scenario, is there any possibility of going into the high elliptical or the lunar flyby just on battery? Would there be enough time?
We will look at the situation post translunar injection, and Rick and Judd, you can add whatever you feel is appropriate here. But I mean, it really would come down to what is the power balance of the vehicle. We would obviously, if we didn't have a fully articulating solar array wing, what level of power are we producing? Is the solar array still attached, or did it just shear off? And then you would have to look at what mitigations and tools do you have in your toolkit to do that. It would be a situation where you'd probably want a little bit of time to look at it and assess what your power balance is before you would decide whether to come home quickly. I don't know, Rick, do you have thoughts on Irene's question in terms of a broken solar array type of situation?
Like you said, Mike, it really depends on the scenario. What are we dealing with? But I can say that if we have 3 fully functioning solar arrays, we can execute the entire mission. So we just have to assess what's going on with that one problematic array and then make a decision from there.
Here, front row.
With Talking Space. It's probably for Mike or Charlie. If I understand correctly, the flight termination system has a set amount of time that it can still be out on the pad before it needs to be rolled back and changed out. So how far out can you go with attempts before you would need to change that system out?
Do you want to take that one, Charlie?
Sure. So our flight termination system carries 2 parameters with it. It's a 20 and a 25-day parameter. The 20 is from the time we test the system end-to-end in the VAB to the first launch attempt, and then after 25 days, we need to retest it again. And the only place that we can test it is in the VAB. And so when you look at when we started that test in the VAB, we'll certainly meet our 20-day on that initial launch attempt. And when you play out the days, it gets us through the opportunity on the 5th.
All right, and one last question over here.
Hi, thank you. Ken Kramer, Space Up Close. Talking about hurricanes and Orion, my question is, what if a hurricane or a tropical cyclone develops in the Pacific on our way back? What are your options to alter the trajectory? And I wonder also the length of the mission. Could you do another loop around the moon and extend the mission to avoid that? Thank you.
Yeah, Rick, we talked this one at the agency flight readiness review, and you've got a plan. So do you want to take this one, Rick or Judd?
Yeah, well, I'll do the first part, and then I'll let Judd address the return piece of it. Yes, we'll be assessing the weather while we're in the distant retrograde orbit before we depart the orbit and make that assessment. And we could stay in the DRO. It's a very stable orbit. There's very minimal use of consumables as far as prop or anything else. So we could easily stay in the DRO for another lap, which is another couple weeks. And then I'll hand it over to Judd to cover options for the entry piece of it.
Yes, for the entry piece, essentially our trajectory over the face of the Earth is set way back at that RPF or when we do our deorbit burn from the moon. So we only have a fixed amount of things that we can do to correct that. We do have the ability to essentially, if depending on where we decide we want to do that, we have the ability to modify the timing that we get to the Earth by maybe plus or minus a day, but that means we have to know really a week in advance. Other than that, the day of, we have the ability to either land a little bit longer, closer into to San Diego, kind of near the Catalina Islands, or we can land shorter, which will be up to 1,200 nautical miles away from San Diego Site 3, which is our main landing site. Obviously, we can make that decision. We'll make that decision 3 days or so before we actually get to entry interface, and that'll be in consultation with Melissa and her team, as that the ship will be about halfway in between that 1,200 nautical mile range and 600 nautical miles to make the decision whether that team heads inland or continues out to the 1,200 nautical mile range.
Okay, that'll wrap up today's briefing. Thank you to all of our participants, and thank you to all of you guys who had such insightful questions and also for your interest in Artemis I. Again, launch of this uncrewed flight test is in less than 2 days, and the 2-hour launch window opens at 8:33 a.m. Eastern Time. You can learn more about this historic mission online or on our social media channels that we'll pull up on the screen for you here in a second. And then our live coverage on NASA TV will begin at 6:30 a.m. Monday, also on our streaming channels. We hope you can join us.